As we begin chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, we encounter the first reference to the matters that the Corinthians had written to Paul about. And I think it is important to notice that Paul did not actually deal with these matters straight away when he began to write. And that was because they were more serious problems that needed to be dealt with that they hadn't actually written about. So their sense of what was important was evidently not the same as Paul's, and it can be the same in our own lives. Too often we fail to understand what our real problems are. So we're going to read today from chapter 7 and verses 1 to 6 of 1 Corinthians. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not the one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. This is a very important chapter on the subject of marriage that all Christians should be well versed in, particularly in the modern day when marriage, as the Bible presents it, has been greatly devalued and is in danger of being completely destroyed. At the same time, it is important that we understand that in these verses, Paul is dealing with the specific issues raised in the letter that the Corinthians wrote. He's not actually writing a comprehensive doctrinal statement on the entire subject of marriage. So the first issue raised by the Corinthians occupies verses 1 to 24, and it's summed up in the words, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman," verse number 1. Now, like previous statements in 1 Corinthians, this was possibly a catchphrase used by the Corinthians. So, while sexual sin had been tolerated in Corinth in chapter 5, there may also have been those who promoted the view that all sexual relations were incompatible with the Christian life. In order to truly serve God in holiness and devotion, one had to be celibate. So to put it another way, the question might have been, does holy and devoted Christian service demand celibacy? And some may think that's the logical conclusion of what Paul has written about in chapters 5 and 6. So in these verses, Paul is explicitly against celibacy, as indeed was the Lord Jesus. He recognized that a physical, intimate relationship for human beings was part of God's created order, and that God had created a framework within which it could be properly expressed, in other words, marriage. He went as far as to underline that a husband and wife owe this physical intimacy to each other. It is an obligation which has been assumed within marriage, and only within marriage, which must be honoured. That's what he means by, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence in verse 3. And that's why he urges them, defraud ye not one the other in verse 5. So another important point in these verses is that Paul underlines the biblical order for marriage that God placed in creation at the beginning. He wrote, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband, verse 2. Paul underlines the balance of the sexes within marriage, and he indicates that this is to avoid fornication, verse 2. That this arrangement avoids fornication indicates that any other type of intimacy would involve the sin of fornication. And it is important that Christians in this modern world are able to live out these Christian principles in their own lives.